Welcome to this Q&A video. A couple of weeks ago I invited the good people who are supporting me on Patreon if they had any questions that they wanted me to answer. A number of them responded, so I am going to draw from those, plus a couple of comments on videos that raised questions I thought would be quite interesting to talk about. So let's dive straight in. Ken asked this. Hi Mallen, what is your definition of fascism? The word tends to get thrown around quite a bit, but it seems to be difficult to nail down a definition. It seems to have something to do with a group's preparedness to use violence against other people in order to achieve a political goal. However, this definition would make any armed insurrection, such as the American War for Independence, a fascist movement, which doesn't seem right. What are your thoughts? When I use the phrase, I tend to use it in the original definition from the dictionary of a political movement, which makes it clear brings together the concepts of totalitarianism, ideological purity, nationalism, one-party rule, selecting for the strong and removing the weak, plus then of course the routine use of violence. Something distinctive in the use of violence as a day-to-day tool of government, not just as a process of a revolutionary movement, where a society falls into conflict on its way to a political resolution. Of course, what Ken's question is really alluding to is the fact that it's a term that's in the process of being devalued by overuse to describe vaguely authoritarian tendencies, real or imagined. It's not the only word that's being devalued like that. I mean, numerous words that end in ism, like racism or sexism. For me, this is the difference between using words as descriptive, values-neutral words to describe a phenomenon or an object, or using words as a means of attack. A values-heavy label intending to badge people and define them, and the people using it in that case have an interest in widening the scope of the label so that it can be held to apply to whoever is their target. Because in that case, they're using it to smear their target with the full implication of a dictionary definition of a word, but without the discipline over whether that definition actually applies. If you take that sort of name calling literally, it will make your head spin because the definitions are purely self-serving down to whoever's using it. Some of the people using words like that are more likely to actually be the ones supporting authoritarian approaches. All the jokes about Antifa, using fascism to smash fascism. But even with the looser definition, the targets of their actions are not even remotely fascist. And the fact that they're violent bullies doesn't make them fascists either. I mean, deeply unpleasant, yes. And anti-democratic, yes. It's related, but it's not the same thing. I think it was easier when the term was very specific in its meaning. But, words change their meaning through common usage. Dictionaries now do tend to include two definitions. One, the full political meaning, and one, the tending towards authoritarian meaning. The actual history of the 1940s showed us the dark forces of human nature that can be released under the wrong circumstances. Fascism provided a platform for that darkness. When people throw the label around today, it's not because they're in tune with the literal meaning of what fascism was as a political movement. If anything, it's because they're afraid that those dark aspects of human nature remain just below the surface. So they see it at every turn, waiting to be unleashed. There are things to be careful about. We do have a dark side. People who did evil things in Nazi Germany, many of them, most of them, started out as ordinary people. Devaluing the term through overuse doesn't really help us to retain the seriousness of what it describes. All right, on to the next one. Dennis gave a link to a UK Met Office presentation on the state of the UK Climate Report 2019. He said, I did try to watch the presentation and failed. Bombarded with multiple stats, designed to confuse. The cynic in me looks at the dates range selected as dubious or perfectly reasonable. The presentation is a brief overview, which is also neatly summarised by this graphic. I thought the presentation was okay. As to the information, let's talk about the framing of your question first, and then we'll look at the framing of the information itself. If you ask, was it designed to confuse? You're speculating to some degree as to purpose and intent. I frequently say on here, I'm not a mind reader, and I'd encourage you to take that approach as well. Is something confusing? If so, what makes it confusing? Many things in the world produced by human beings are confusing. That got that way just because communication's hard and people vary in their communication skills. If you live in a world where your starting presumption is to suspect that if something is confusing, then it's a deliberate trick for some nefarious end, not only will you spend your life being suspicious of everything, but you'll probably take wrong actions because of valid information that you'll end up disregarding. I try to be critical and skeptical of statements and information because I'm generally interested to know the truth, but also of the view that in the absence of specific evidence to the contrary, people and groups of people have a broad tendency to integrity. Now, I know systems go wrong all the time. Individuals are prone to corruption, groups are susceptible to groupthink. When that happens, there's generally evidence that's more concrete than the sort of thing that conspiracy theorists tend to peddle. But it happens a lot less than people think. And there are usually specific and proportionate incentives to encourage the bad behaviour as opposed to the good. Now, the Met Office is funded by the UK government predominantly to provide weather forecasting services. It doesn't have any particular incentives to push anything except what proves to be accurate after the event. So as far as the Met Office is concerned, I think they tend to show a good degree of integrity. The one or two higher profile Met Office climate scientists are ones that I see on Twitter, often correcting claims of the extreme activists and refraining from politicising the issue, which doesn't mean say that I don't have quibbles with some of the language used in the presentation. But then, I quibble about most things. Take this from the page that contains the video presentation. Our report shows climate change is exerting an increasing impact on the UK's climate. This year was warmer than any other year in the UK between 1884 and 1990. And since 2002, we have seen the warmest 10 years in the series. By contrast, to find a year in the coldest 10, we have to go back to 1963, over 50 years ago. The Central England temperature series shows us that the 21st century so far has been warmer than the previous 3 centuries. The Central England mean temperature for the period 2001 to 2019 has been 10.3 degrees centigrade. The remaining averages in the series are 1901 to 2000, 9.5 degrees, 1801 to 1900, 9.1 degrees, 1701 to 1800, 9.2 degrees, and 1659 to 1700, 8.7 degrees. The bulk of that is a bunch of facts. And, if we don't like the facts, kind of too bad. As the saying goes, facts don't care about your feelings. There are certain areas where the expression is sloppy though. For instance, our report shows climate change is exerting an increasing impact on the UK's climate. That would be better expressed in my view, as our report shows the climate of the last decade to be compatible with expectations from a growing impact from global warming. Generally, scientists understand that attribution is difficult at a local level and are careful about how they frame things without specific backup. The comparison of the average temperatures for previous centuries is fair, relevant information, although I think they should have pointed out that the 20 years so far in this century is not a long enough time period to take an average to compare with previous centuries. The 20th century was pretty much separated into 3 chapters, with the start of the 1940s warming, the 40s and 70s cooling, and then warming ever since. That said, if you resist the logic of a message because you're holding out hope that a cold spell will be along shortly, it's an exercise in wishful thinking, not a valid critique of statistical information. Some of the rest of the text suffers a bit from one of the human foibles that kind of irritates me in all sorts of contexts, which is the search for new records. Things like 6% fewer days of air frost and 10% fewer days of ground frost in the UK compared with the 1981 to 2010 average. I know skeptics will think this is something that climate alarmists do, but it's something that everybody does. I'm a big tennis fan, and the commentators are forever banging on about utterly pointless records. And I mean, fair enough if you get one that turns into the longest tennis match of all time. That's a meaningful record up to a point. But you get things like, in the last 10 years, that's the first time an American has gone on to win having lost the first 2 sets in a Grand Slam. Really? That's a stat that means nothing. But they're constantly coming up with them. And so it is with most stats. The UK has a highly variable climate and records get set all the time in all sorts of ways depending on how granular you go. If you decide every time they quote one of those it's dark propaganda, then you're leaving no space for people to do what they do all the time anyway. And why do they do it all the time anyway? Because they're trying to make what they do interesting. So look, here's my bottom line on the Met Office report. Weather is highly variable. This year so far we've seen wetter winter than usual, followed by an exceptionally hot and dry spell in the spring. Is it really unusual? Yes. Unusual doesn't mean unprecedented, no one's claiming that it does, but for instance, the wheat harvest will be 40% down this year on usual because it's been a particularly unhelpful combination. Next year will probably be different, and no one's going to starve. But the tendency is that the averages are getting warmer. Without running around and flapping our arms in the air, that's what the data shows. What we decide to do with that information is down to us. Okay, Harvey says this. Hi Mallen, it would be interesting to get your perspective on the limits, if any, to free speech. We can probably agree that yelling fire in a movie theatre is bad. In Canada, we have somewhat nebulous anti-hate speech laws which seem generally well accepted by the population. In the UK, hate speech laws seem to be even more broad, equally bad, a strict limit to what can be said during trials. What are your thoughts? It's all highly topical at the moment because Scotland specifically has a proposed new hate speech law that would significantly extend reach in that area and overextend it as far as many people are concerned. My general position on all of this is straightforward. It should all be permitted unless it's directly commissioning harm. I never yet met a government regulator whose judgment on what is or isn't hateful is something that I would want to trust. The number of things in a society right now that are demonstrably, factually correct, but have nevertheless become held as unsayable, should make it clear that we're really facing something of a crisis in free speech. And it feels as though we're fighting a rearguard action at best, and it matters. So some random examples that we could easily have noticed over recent months and years. The impact of massive immigration in Europe has been significant, and a lot of it has been negative. It's intuitively obvious that if you bring in large numbers of particularly single young men from cultures with very different attitudes, it's going to create consequences. Now, because people are scared of where that sort of discussion might lead, most media and politicians point blank refuse to even acknowledge it was an issue until it gets to the point where those consequences can't be ignored anymore. And even then, many won't see it. The explosion of rioting in Malmö in Sweden last weekend is a case in point. It got some coverage, but not a huge amount. If you ignore a growing problem, sooner or later, someone will elect themselves to step in and give the hornet's nest a good old kick, which somebody did in that case, turning up to organise a burning of the Quran close to a strong Muslim population. It's very easy to see how trying to have a frank and fact-focused discussion about immigration could lead to statements that some would hold to be encouraging hatred against certain groups. Then there's another topical question about whether people from certain ethnic minorities are more at risk from coronavirus, or is it actually because it's connected to obesity, and we just have public officials who won't say out loud that higher levels of obesity are actually connected with those ethnic groups. And I mean, I don't know if that's the case or not, but it is clear that some people are actively avoiding talking about that topic. And so you're left to wonder, because we are now into a world where people often self-censor on issues that they think are going to be controversial, and therefore you don't get to hear some basic facts that would enable you to make up your own mind. The coronavirus doesn't care about political sensitivities, obviously. If there are things that make a material difference that we're not discussing because of fear of how it might be regarded as hate speech, then we're not doing the people in those communities any favours. Those are just a couple of examples of how the deadening impact associated with widely drawn conceptions of stirring up hatred have unintended consequences. So, as few restrictions on free speech as possible, just those commissioning harm. Okay. Let's take a couple of comments. First, a comment on the Leaders We Deserve video. I quite enjoy your analysis and commentary on several matters, but your dislike for Trump shines through and ruins your objectivity. You can't possibly compare the kind of damage and severity of things Biden says or does to Trump's. This pursuit as being seen as fair and objective, and therefore finding similar problems in both men, is absurd and patently dishonest. There's some confusion here about what objectivity means in the context of these sorts of videos. No, that's not how this works. I don't pursue objectivity by making sure I balance one critical comment on one side with an equally critical comment on the other. If one group's running a highly effective campaign, I'll say so. And if the other one at the same time is running an appalling campaign, again, I'll say so. And the way of it is that in that instance, then I'll get a bunch of people accusing me of bias. Because in the world of partisan commentary, it's unusual for anyone to attack someone outside of a partisan narrative. And I'm not interested in a partisan narrative. I'm interested in understanding what's going on. If you're the kind of person who's going to get cross if I point out something inconvenient to your cause, sooner or later you'll get cross. So in the video, The Leaders We Deserve, it was a week when Trump had a pretty disastrous interview where he was trying to argue that you shouldn't look at COVID deaths per population, and he couldn't articulate why not. And then Biden had a disastrous interview when he reacted to a question about mental decline by whittering aimlessly. Generally, the partisans who have some grounding in campaign realities agreed that their man had had a bad week in that instance. But true believers will never concede such a thing. The true believer wants everything to be a campaign message. So after every debate, they want to say why their man won the debate, regardless of what happened. Just like all the Tony Heller true believers who tell me how ardently they want me to debate him. And I said I'd be happy to do a head-to-head debate in a live event sometime, but nobody should be under any illusion that those people will do anything but conclude that their man was a massive winner, regardless of what is said and done. Some of them say things like, please debate Tony so that we can make up our mind. None of the true believers are going to change their mind in those sorts of debates. Debates like that are for entertainment, and that's fine. Entertainment is good. So when I criticised Extinction Rebellion's strategy for its counterproductive campaigns, I had people telling me that I had some good points, but it wasn't being helpful for the cause for me to point them out. Well, I'm not interested in a cause that can't be promoted by the truth. One of the reasons I wasn't suited for party politics was my propensity to look critically at my own side in the same way that I look critically at my own performance. Being clear about faults should be a route towards getting better. Though that's not how ideological movements work. So there you go. You'll appreciate this channel if you want a non-ideological take on events. It's always open for challenge and discussion, and can accept that sometimes it won't be the same as your take. If you're a true believer, you might still get value if you can appreciate the benefits of having your beliefs challenged from time to time, because if your side is right, then you have nothing to fear. If you can't cope with that, sooner or later I'll piss you off and you'll leave. Okay, one more comment from the Lessons for Climate Change from the Pandemic video. Dear Mr. Baker, I actually agree this time with most of what you said, but I cannot find anywhere a serious scientific attempt to address the most obvious question: how did the almost global lockdown affect the climate? Logically, 6 months of radical reduction in industrial production, motorised transportation and commercial activities should have caused a dramatic reduction in carbon emissions. Did this happen? And if it did, have carbon levels in the atmosphere gone down? First of all, following on from that previous answer, I note from your first sentence that you often don't agree with what I say. So well done for being exactly that kind of person who's willing to expose themselves to arguments and content that you disagree with. That is the true skeptical mindset. It's a privilege to have an audience that values my content in spite of differences. As to your question, it's based on a conceptual error of how the CO2 climate mechanism works. The thing about CO2 is that it persists in the atmosphere for a very long period of time. I mean, it will weather out over a geological time frame, but within human time frames, it's effectively permanent. So a reduction in emissions in the short term would never be expected to reduce the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. The most it would do would be to reduce the speed of the increase. People have used the example of filling a bath with water. If you turn the tap slightly down, it still continues to fill, just more slowly. According to Carbon Brief, they estimate that CO2 levels will rise by 2.48 parts per million in 2020. This increase is 0.32 parts per million smaller than if there hadn't been a lockdown, equivalent to about 11% of the expected rise, which seems about right because although certain causes such as air travel and other transportation went down, across the world coal power was still generating electricity, and while some countries were locking down, others were not yet affected. This is why people talk about the need to get ultimately to net zero carbon, because the concentration only stops going up when we stop adding to it. It's not the case that if we bring it down a bit, then it starts to decline back to where it was. Okay, Patreon supporter Alex asks this. What are your current thoughts on how one might try to understand and mitigate their cognitive biases in some sort of systematic way? And this leads him to the practical ask. How can enough people agree on a shared view of base reality to make real progress on solving the world's most pressing problems? Is it still doable? What type of changes and innovation would it take? Those are two different questions, even though they're related. Firstly, Alex, I like the way you asked the question because yes, you're right. You can't eliminate your cognitive biases. You can hope to understand and mitigate them to some extent. I don't claim to be an expert on how you could mitigate your own cognitive biases. I can only describe the approach that I take. And because researching and producing these videos is now something that I prioritise, I probably put more time into this than is reasonable for most people, or indeed necessary. The key factors for me have been, one, working on empathy, taking time to understand how the world seems to others, not just to yourself. And that one's huge. People with a strong ideology are least able to do it. It's what leads them to conclude that others are badly intentioned so readily. Two, seeing events relatively without moral judgment in an attempt to understand them. Doesn't necessarily mean that you lose your morality or anything like that, but you avoid allowing it to influence your perception of events. Likewise, number three, stepping outside of partisan framing. I talk about that a bit in the How to Think About Climate Change series. And how do you encourage any of those things? For me, it starts by reading widely outside your specific areas of interest. Read the outputs of different perspectives. Consume content deliberately from people of the opposing point of view to the one that you're considering. So, for instance, I read a non-fiction book 2 hours every day. I have my to-read pile entered onto a database that selects the next one to read at random. And whenever I see a reference to an area of interest, so something that piques my curiosity, I make sure to add a book or two highly rated from that area to the list. If I read an anti-BBC book, as I have done recently, I make sure to add a couple written by current or former BBC journalists as well to get a different perspective on the same issues. I monitor a range of RSS feeds with news sources and blogs. I make sure to have different perspectives represented there. And if you really want to get the mindset, I'd recommend that you read Philip Tetlock's book on super forecasting. Super forecasters beat everyone else hands down for being able to predict what things will happen in the short term, precisely because they bring this sort of outlook to their research. And the interesting thing about applying it into predictions is that you get frequent feedback on whether your perceptions were correct or not. So imagine if you're going to try to predict whether Trump or Biden were going to win the election. The vast majority of people will simply swear that their favoured side is definitely going to win. And you can see that every day in the discussion forums of these videos, all the time. And of course, half of them will be proved right. It won't owe anything to their judgment because it's a 50-50 proposition. Next time around, they won't have any better chance of being right. Tetlock found that the majority of experts making predictions in their own fields of expertise were no more accurate than random. And that speaks to how rarely knowledge of a field overcomes cognitive biases in human beings. Only deliberate practice in making a judgment about something without clouding your perception with prior beliefs will make you better at doing it. There was a telling anecdote in Tetlock's book where one of the super forecasters, who was normally a strong performer, failed in predicting whether or not the Japanese Prime Minister would visit the controversial Yasukuni Shrine. He decided that he wouldn't, but then he did. And he identified afterwards that he failed because he inadvertently answered the question, what would he have done if he had been the Prime Minister, rather than trying to find out the perspective of the incumbent and whether it was the sort of thing that would have appealed to him. So that's a failure of empathy. But unlike most occasions, he got immediate feedback that highlighted his mistake that he could learn from. We learn from results. Now, I don't do a lot of predictions, but I put my thoughts into videos, and I don't particularly want them to age badly. So I get some degree of feedback as to how I'm viewing the world. If you can find your own way of keeping score, that will help you more than anything else. As to the second half of your question, getting people to agree on a shared reality, we have to build a stronger centre. Right now, our problem is that in the US particularly, to some extent the UK as well and elsewhere, the centre has collapsed and we have people being pulled into the extremes. If you can step back from the immediate challenges of that, the compellingness of it, which is hard because obviously it feels pretty bloody awful what's going on right now. But if you can, then you realise that such a process has happened before in history and the moment eventually will pass and the country will regroup. Not into some idealistic, happy, kumbaya paradise, but nevertheless the centre will rebuild and people will broadly find an anchor there. History is full of moments when the centre fell apart and had to be rediscovered. So the challenge is not to lose yourself to the madness and think about how ultimately the rebuilding will take place. It's like they say, when you fight a war with a view to building the peace at the end of it. It's why, for instance, on climate change, I see the hope in the moderate Republican base. Solid, proportionate action that avoids pretending nothing's happening, but rejects also the extreme radicalism on the other side. That will eventually become the gathering point. It'll take a while before it finds fertile enough ground for it to stick. But bear in mind as well, you don't always have to have everyone seeing things the same way for changes to happen. Because the necessary has a habit of forcing itself on society, whether society wants it or not. The world is moving towards a non-carbon based energy, whether you think it should or not. So you either engage with the process and try to get it working as well as possible so everyone can continue to enjoy all the benefits that we value, or you can leave it to others who might not share those objectives. And generally there are always enough pragmatists who will see that, well, this is the way we decided to go as a global thing. We might as well dominate the market and profit by it. All right. There's one more question from a Patreon supporter on whether climate temperatures we're seeing now have been seen before in the Holocene and whether we are not that out of whack with recent history. That question will be featured in a bonus video exclusively for patrons, accessible via Patreon. One small way I can thank all the people who support me on there and make these videos possible. Thanks for watching. See you next time.